All right, good morning everyone. We're excited to get started today with our webinar, Navigating a Reset of the Global Economic Order, brought to you by the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and Texas A&M's Bush School of Government. My name is Madeline Field. I'll be your moderator today. I'm an assistant editor at War on the Rocks, where I contribute to our Cogs of War vertical, which focuses on defense tech and industrial-based issues. As I'm sure everyone is aware, it's been a very busy few months and years for economic statecraft. From tariffs to new industrial policies and export controls, we are all navigating a world in which the United States and China are almost unilaterally changing the economic norms and status quo. It is also the 5th year that the Potomac Institute and Bush School have hosted their annual Summit on Economic Statecraft, which brings together policymakers, think tankers, industry leaders, and the broader academic community. Despite the summit happening this year during the government shutdown, the energy was contagious, with so many there in their personal capacities. Broader themes, trends, and policy recommendations have emerged from the panels themselves, of course, but also hallway sidebars and follow-on dialogues. I'm very excited for this unique opportunity today to discuss what the community is thinking about and continue those challenging conversations with our two panelists. Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow at the Potomac Institute, and Dr. Will Norris, an associate professor at the Bush School. Thank you both for joining us. A couple of notes: if you missed this year's summit, we've got you covered. You can read these new and excellent recommendations from this year's summit by accessing the brand new report in the chat and on the Institute's website. Also, if you have any questions, please make sure to drop them in the chat. If we can't get them during our live discussion today, Tim and Will get back to you with answers and questions later. Tim, turning it over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Maddie, for working with us on this. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to share this new report with the world, and excited to have Will as my partner in crime on this, as well as Texas A&M. This has been a great partnership between the two organizations, and now we have War on the Rocks working with us too. So I think it's first of all appropriate to say, hey, what got us to this point? Like, why are we even talking about this? Why did we have a summit? Why have we had several summits now? What is that all about? So if you look back, 30 years, there was this optimism that China, if we opened up to them 30 plus years, that they would see the light. They'd turn into a more democratic society, that we would have these free and open markets flowing with them, and things would be all great. Well, it doesn't seem so to be the case. And while our countries have matured together and built robust economic relationships, that the dynamics, especially in the most recent years, have changed to be a little bit more adversarial than we ever envisioned. And so economics are really being used asymmetrically, right, for statecraft to get to objectives that we might not, as a country, see being in a good direction, right? So, and of course, because a lot of the actions that have taken place are economically focused, it's important to bring together policymakers, the business community, academia, all those that have expertise in those areas or are directly practicing those areas. It's an opportunity for these groups to get together and talk about where we're at. So this most recent summit really was focused on, okay, well, a lot has changed with regard to industrial policy and economic statecraft in the last 12 months. This is since the new administration came in, and even more so since over the last 18 months, when the last time we had this summit. So we really asked the business sector or policymakers, academics that came here. So what has changed and why has it mattered, and where should we be moving forward? So that's a baseline for where we're at. Or why we did what we did, and we've continued to do this work. So.
Awesome. So you've both spent the last couple of years talking to leaders across academia, industry, and government, and you all have identified three common themes that have emerged from this year's summit and different conversations. The first is that economic issues and national security are increasingly intertwined. The second is that the U.S.-China relationship has gone from a relationship of competition to compellence and coercion. And the third is that state intervention in economic markets is becoming more popular, as are more assertive state industrial policies. So could you go into sort of the reasons amidst this shifting couple of months that you chose those themes and where you see those themes going?
Yeah, so Will, do you want to take the first one there? Or
Yeah, so Maddie, as you suggested, these are really sort of trends that we've seen emerging from the conversations that happened around the symposium. The reason that we started doing this 5 years ago was because the way we think about economic statecraft itself, the idea of what is this when countries use economic tools in a strategic capacity, when that happens, especially in the United States, there's an important role that's being played by the private sector and the private sector actors. And one of the things that tends not to happen organically in our system is a useful conversation between the private sector and US government folks. That's a big part of what we do with these symposia, is to provide a platform to facilitate those kinds of conversations, because typically private sector thinks about interacting with government through lobbyists or through legislation or those kinds of activities. And that's not exactly what we're looking at when you think about economic statecraft. And typically, government will think about interacting with the private sector through regulations or through different sort of more adversarial paradigms of interacting with the private sector. And one of the things that became apparent to us quite early on was that to do economic statecraft effectively, you need to have cooperative venues for communicating across these two worlds, really. And that's a big part of what we try to do with the Economic Statecraft program and with this symposium that we've been convening. So when we brought this one together, we knew that a lot had shifted, and we no longer had to convince people this was an important topic. Now the question was, yeah, this is a really important topic. What are we doing? Where are we? What's been going on? What's changed? And so these trends that you've highlighted, Maddie, in the report, these are sort of some of the themes that we heard coming from the participants across the 2 days of the summit. And the reason we wanted to put this report out was because a lot of people that were there said, this is really terrific, but what about all my colleagues that aren't here? What about my other players in the space, in my industry, or other companies that I engage with who aren't here? And so that's what we really wanted to try to do, is to put together some of these big takeaways and sort of the emerging themes and trends that we heard across the multiple days of conversations at the summit, at the symposium. So the first one of these is just that these things are increasingly convergent. Security and economics increasingly dovetail together. The second one is on China. We've really moved away from any pretense of cooperation or trying to find common ground. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. It's just something we kept hearing over and over again from the participants, that is kind of gone. And here today is this increasing acceptance that it's fundamentally on a more coercive and compellent footing, even using terms like economic warfare, which a couple of years ago would have been really surprising and really out of the conventional wisdom to think that this was a component of any species of warfare, economic warfare. But increasingly this year, we heard that term used by a number of participants, by a number of folks on panels, and a growing sort of acceptance or mainstreaming of that paradigm, which we noted was just different than it has been in years before. And that matters for a system like ours, because we have certain things that we'll do in a democracy like the United States during peacetime that will change if we're in war, if we're in a wartime footing. For China, it's a little different because the Communist Party of China is fundamentally a Leninist party. It sort of is always in this conflictual paradigm of international relations, and it's much more of a continuum. So yeah, we're always at war, and we've got these certain things that are coming up or going down in international relations. So on the Chinese side, this conceptualization of the economic dynamic as one of a species of warfare is maybe less stark of a transition, less dramatic of a shift. But on our side, this is quite a big change, because We tend to be black and white. You're either at peacetime or you're at war. And when you're at war, our system is able and willing to do things that we typically would not be doing during a peacetime footing. And that, I think, represented a kind of a new dynamic that we observed in this year's symposium that we hadn't seen as much in previous years.
No, I'll agree with you, Will, on that. From personal experience, having been in this realm for quite some time now, you think about the 2017-18 timeframe when the new National Defense Strategy came out at the time that really shifted focus on China. And at the time, it was a very big shift. And folks were timid in calling the coercive and asymmetric activities on the economic front warfare, to your point. However, it's very, if you study military strategy, you're familiar with Sun Tzu, and their approach is very Sun Tzu, right? It's, to your point, a very continuous type of thing. It's fighting without kinetics, right? Without outward violence, and it's setting objectives and following a path to get to those objectives. And to that point, China's been very forward with what its objectives are in the series of 5-year plans that it puts out, pursuing those methodically, be it overtly or more covertly, right? Stealing intellectual property and exploiting it, or working through state-owned companies that have a front that might not look like they're state-owned and such. So, but the idea, to your point, that and then the words that go along with whether or not we are at war have definitely matured and changed. And this was definitely the across business, government, and academia, and all three of those historically have had some hesitation. From what I saw, our observations, there's a lot more comfort with saying and acknowledging that there is an economic war going on. Now, what we're doing about it was the focus of the rest of the summit. What's going on in all those realms, which was interesting, and again, because that's changed just in the last 12 months. So we're going to continue to talk about that.
Yeah, so I think that's a perfect transition into our next section, which is the 7 strategic trends that you all identified through the last year. The first being, that the U.S. and China are engaged in economic warfare. I think that might be controversial to some, maybe not to this community, but what is your definition of economic warfare? And, as you said, what's changed just in the last couple of months?
So, and this is just kind of building on what we were talking about. I think both countries have moved to de-risk security and economic interests, right, as a nation. And in doing so, it's become a zero-sum kind of competition going on. And so in carrying out activities, because it's zero-sum, sharper elbows and actions have transpired, and so it looks a lot more coercive than and a lot more sharp than it has in the past. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing that play out definitely in the markets and the discourse back and forth. Will, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that that this is sort of a growing comfort is the way to maybe think about this, that these different communities are increasingly growing more comfortable operating from a paradigm of inherent conflict, inherent conflictual interests, a zero-sum concept, the idea that both sides can benefit or that there's a win-win solution set somewhere out there to be discovered, I think is becoming in the rearview mirror. And that's, I'm not saying that's a good thing, it's a bad thing. I'm just saying this is what we heard. This is what people who were coming to the conference were sort of having conversations about and acknowledging and sort of recognizing. And then what was interesting was the way these various communities were responding to that new reality. So I think one of the things that we saw on the USG side, particularly in the last 12 months, is a real willingness to use some of these tools like tariffs or export controls in pretty novel and innovative ways. A strong emphasis on reindustrialization, on bringing manufacturing back to the United States, on really examining the areas where potentially the United States economy is overly dependent on external partners. And that could be both partners and allies and adversaries. Of course, there's different levels of comfort with either of those kinds of dependencies. But there was a lot of conversations around how to navigate these new dynamics. And I think that one of the interesting things that we kept hearing was the private sector looking for clear signals from the USG about their priorities, where they're headed, where they're going, and then the USG folks saying, how could we be any more clear? We are telling you exactly what we're doing and where you need to be going. You guys just don't want to do it. You want to go back to the old ways or whatever. So that was kind of an interesting point of maybe talking past each other, or at least highlighting for us, again, as the conveners, as the hosts of this, just an area where there seems to be more work to be done. Either the private sector needs to listen better, or the USG needs to be saying things more clearly. And so I think that there's an area there for continued engagement going forward. Over.
Tim, I think that brings us back to industry. You said that some industry is very aware of the risks and the dynamics of U.S.-China competition. Some is less so. As Will was alluding to, what are some steps that the government can be taking to clarify its message and to make more industry aware of these challenges?
Yeah, so I want to hammer on a point here that one of the things that we heard different, right, is in industry, and I think this reinforces what Will was saying. Industry is really becoming attuned to what's going on more so, and yes, it's a spectrum. It depends on how much business they have with China or abroad, and China's not the only actor, right? There's other actors to this in this regard. But one of the things, Will, that you and I and these various groups that we've been working with over the last several years, it always comes to the front, right? Is that the private sector is really in the driver's seat. No matter what policy comes out, that the private sector is thirsty for understanding kind of what the dynamics are, so they can do a risk assessment and understand where they're going to move forward, how they're going to move forward, what they're going to invest in, so they can understand what the return on investment is. They can understand maybe timelines, and so they're still working on trying to figure out what that looks like. But really, the private sector is a critical actor. And one of the things that came to front during the observations of the summit was that the policy community needs to continue to help the private sector understand the dynamics and what their objectives are on the policy side. So the public sector can adapt and adjust when they're thinking about risk, when they're thinking about how we move forward, when we think about leadership and all that kind of stuff. So,
do you think there's an appropriate entity that exists today that's able to do that and reach the entire private sector, or is that something that should be created sort of in the next couple of years?
Will, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Maddie, and it kind of gets to some of the recommendations that came out of the summit. So, and the reality is that this is uncharted waters for the United States. We've never been this big, this globally integrated, and taken these dramatic of measures to leverage that capacity and those capabilities. So this is all brand new. So we're going to try a lot of things. Some of these things are going to work really well. Some of these things aren't going to work as well as others. We need to be able to evaluate and assess and get the capacity to understand what's working, what's not, what do we need to double down on, where do we need to ease up. And really, we need to be thinking about how do we do this kind of activity? How do we use economics in a strategic capacity in a way that's going to be sustainable for what could be a decades-long paradigm of competition and these competitive dynamics? And you want to do it in a way that's going to resonate to the strengths of the United States. There's certain things the United States is really world-class at. Nobody can touch us in certain areas, like radical innovation. We get the best and the brightest from around the world that come to this country. That gives us huge advantages in a competitive dynamic. So when we think about how to organize this, or how we want to organize ourselves, or where we want to center this line of effort, and this gets back to your question, Maddie, there isn't a natural go-to single point right now in the way that we're organized, because Frankly, a lot of economic statecraft is not a natural state of being for the United States, at least the way that we're thinking about it today. And this gets to one of the things in the report lays out kind of a three-part definition of economic statecraft. And this, I think, is conceptually important to understand because, as Tim said, the private sector is in the driver's seat for a reason, because economics, this thing that we call economics, economic activity is really conducted by private sector commercial actors. They're the ones that are making decisions about where to put a factory, how many people to employ, how many people to lay off, what to do for investment next quarter. Those are all private sector decisions, and they're going to happen at that microeconomic level where individual commercial actors are going to optimize what they think is in their own best interests, given market dynamics or market opportunities or competitive dynamics in their sector. Those are all going to be influences on these microeconomic decisions that companies are going to be making. So that's step one to recognize. Like, that's the reality. That's the way the world works. That's the way economics works. Step two is sometimes these decisions, sometimes these economic, self-interested optimizations that firms do are going to matter for national security. I'm going to decide to offshore this particular part of my supply chain, or I'm going to decide to get my critical minerals from this place and not this place. Those decisions matter for national security. So that's step two of the definition, these things that I call security externalities, these things that may not be endogenous to the decision, but still matter for national security. And so step three is when governments decide, you know what, I care about that externality and I want to do something that's going to change the incentives that the private sector faces so they do more of something or less of something else that I don't like. So that incentive tweaking, if you will, that changing of the incentives facing the commercial actors, that is economic statecraft. And I think that paradigm is a useful paradigm that has found increasing traction in the DC policy world because it comports to reality. And I think it acknowledges the reality that government's agency is fundamentally circumscribed in the sense that it has to act through these private sector players because that's the way we're set up. We are not a state-run economy. We are not a kind of place where you can just make decisions and then the private sector salutes and says, aye, aye, Captain, we're off to the races. Now, what they will do is the private sector will optimize its own best interests. So you could create tax incentives, or you could create subsidies, or you could create certain kinds of programs that are designed to stimulate certain kinds of responses from the private sector. And so the reality today, Maddie, to get back to your question, is those authorities are scattered across. My team and I have taken a close look at the U.S. government. We've identified more than 1,200 different offices and departments scattered across something like 13 departments and agencies that have some piece of this economic statecraft puzzle. It's not super centrally coordinated right now. Each administration kind of designs this coordinating function as befits that administration and those personalities and those principles. And that's appropriate to our system. That's the way our system works. But we don't really have a single location today that you could say this is the center of gravity for American economic statecraft.
Federation or federated approach, I think, definitely reflects us as a society and the way we work. And so the question is, so how do we be effective, right, versus our adversaries, but remain true to our values, right, our societal values and the way our government works, the way our economy works. That's hard, right? And a couple points to what Will was talking about. We don't have there's not a published economics, security strategy. There's allusions to it in the national security strategy just came out and talked about aspects of it for sure. There's no doctrine, right? How do you carry out? How do you take a strategy and actually execute it? However, to Will's point, there's a lot of offices, organizations, agencies across the government that are doing more tactical to operational level, if you will, and even some with strategic impact things, right, that are good, that are carrying out policy objectives, but it's not necessarily clear who's prioritizing overall, if there is an overall societal approach. And I don't necessarily know if that's the right answer, right? We're navigating through this, right? It's still maturing, I'll tell you, it will be easier. We talked about this just a few minutes ago, right? For industry and businesses to understand risk and understand a path forward and how they're going to invest and how they're going to act if they have maybe some of that more clear policy guidance that's outward. But at the same time, again, we have to reconcile that with the way our society works, the way our economy works historically. So I think we're definitely in a shift here, a change here, and working through it.
Yeah, I want to keep pulling that thread. So the question of who should coordinate this action was a huge controversy, I think, at the summit. I'm sure you could talk about this for weeks, but why is the Defense Department sort of this natural actor, as you've said, that should step forward when Treasury, Commerce, Trade Rep's office have all been working with businesses? Some could say more effectively than the Defense Department has typically worked with businesses.
Yeah, so to your point, and that you just reminded me of something. So USTR, Jameson Greer actually has been out very, very vocal the last few weeks, and actually has, to me, for somebody who's been watching this for quite a while, has actually done a pretty good job of vocalizing kind of the approach at what might seem a less than novel approach historically when you look at the status quo, using tariffs, right, export controls and such. He's been communicating much more so in the last several weeks, and credit to him and his team for doing that. And I think things like that help. But back to your question, well, DoD's, I mean, you got $1 trillion budget, lots of resources. You're in every place around the world, like literally. You buy a lot of stuff, right? You're in your supply chains. You're worried about supply chain vulnerability, right? So it's the big gorilla, right? So it's easy to say, well, you know what, DoD has all those resources and such. They can handle it. But one of the things that we observed, right, during the summit was, okay, well, DoD is supposed to, focus on, prosecuting war from a kinetic sense, right? War fighting, lethality, right? I think about ships and missiles and, how do you, and bombs and guns and all that kind of stuff. So are they necessarily set up or have the expertise to carry out economic statecraft? That was one of the discussions that came up over and over again. Do they have the right talent? Right? If you grow up as an infantry officer in the Army, how does that make you, savvy from a Wall Street perspective and how economic statecraft, or from a foreign policy standpoint? So I think, and you look actually over the last several years. This year included, for the National Defense Authorization Act, right, that has been passed every year for the last 60-something years. But the last several years, DoD has been implicated in provisions to, that's the legislative vehicle that has been used, right, to carry out new laws with regard to how we're going to carry, and reporting requirements and such, oversight. That's been the legislative vehicle to carry out where Congress feels like the country needs to go in that regard. Even with this year's NDAA, there was an entity. We're talking about entities that should have some oversight, or what it was called the Economic Defense Unit on the Senate side. Those provisions were pulled out, and it looks like, I think it's on the floor in the Senate for a final vote. The bill is the final bill, I think, today. But again, we're still going through the machinations of what should we do, who should be in charge. But again, DoD just happens to be an easy target in that regard. The Office of Strategic Capital, again, has been very up and on the forefront of some of this stuff. Again, really with the focus of how do you make sure military missions are safeguarded, right, from from an economic standpoint moving forward? How do we make sure we have custody of the supply chains and understand what's going into them when we're building something that if we need to use for war, we have it, right? So I think all those things are factors in with regard to why DoD has been looked at, but by no means, to Will's point earlier, there's a lot going on across the government. I think it just might be this might be the most visible in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. And Will, what is it in your research of these 1,400 entities that makes it clear to you that the Defense Department should be leading the charge on this?
Well, I think, as Tim mentioned, we don't really yet have doctrine or strategy necessarily, at least publicly articulated, on what economic statecraft ought to look like. And DoD has, among the interagency players, has a deep bench on thinking about how does one develop doctrine. Department of Defense does doctrine. There's full specializations that you would have in your career that would focus you just on being really good at designing doctrine. So they've got processes, they've got the institutional capacity, they've got, as Tim said, the budgets to really at least take a first bite at the apple. The thing that I think is important to bear in mind is how so many of these tools that we have in the US government are spanning and resident in different departments and agencies beyond just the Department of Defense. So as Tim said, DoD has several of these that are squarely in DoD's lane, squarely part of the military piece of our national security. But there's other authorities and other responsibilities and other jurisdictions, if you will, that exist at Commerce and Treasury and the State Department, the intelligence community, USTR. There's all kinds of, within the White House. We've organized ourselves so that little bits and pieces of this larger effort, this larger strategic effort to use economics in a way that's going to resound and reinforce national security, these are largely scattered across the US government. And I think it's important to bear in mind that we are a rule of law society. So this is not a bad thing. Like, we have laws, we have authorities, we have jurisdictions, we have titles, we have lanes that say this lane belongs to this organization and this lane belongs to this organization. So we don't want to fight that. We don't want to deny that. That's who we are, as Tim said earlier. We want to do this in a way that's going to resonate with who the United States is and what our strengths are. So we just have to recognize that right now, by organizing ourselves this way, we have fundamentally shaped how we see strategy in this domain, because what you see tends to be heavily influenced by where you sit. So if your office happens to do export controls and you think of economic statecraft, you're generally going to approach the problem through the lens of what else can we do with export controls. If you happen to be enforcing sanctions and you sit at OFAC and you're thinking, what does economic statecraft look like? Well, this is the way we're going to approach it, because those are the tools that you have at your disposal. But any good strategist will tell you that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. You want to start with, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to affect? And then you want to marshal the right tools against that objective. That's a more strategic way of going about this process. And that's something that I think we're just still early on in that maturation as a government and as a private sector. As we think about the domain of economic statecraft, we haven't gotten to that point yet where we're really deliberately thinking, okay, these are our strategic outcomes we're looking to accomplish. These are the ways we're going to marshal the resources and the tools against those strategic outcomes in a broadly complementary manner across the existing array of capabilities that we have. Right now, we're much more ad hoc. We're much more, well, I've got this tool, so everything looks like a nail, so I'm going to go around and start pounding everything in. And you're like, well, what you have is a hammer, and that's why everything looks like a nail. But this screw would be better done with a screwdriver. Let me show you what a screwdriver looks like. So that's just kind of where we are as a whole of government effort as we try to think about moving forward on this. And I think we'll get it right. I'm confident in our system. I'm confident in our institutions, our capabilities to eventually figure this stuff out. But this is really where I think academia, particularly policy relevant academia and think tanks and the sort of intellectual community, can play a constructive catalytic role by sort of provoking some of those conversations and saying, well, what are we really trying to accomplish here? What does that really look like? And how would one execute reindustrialization in the United States? And if you take ownership stakes of companies, how do we vote those seats? Are you active holders of those equities? Do you sit on the board? Are you passive? Are you just looking to kind of get a veto over decisions that are adversely going to affect the United States security? Or are you going to actively run this company and say this is where it needs to be going? Those are just big picture conversations that we haven't yet had, and that's where I think there's a constructive role to be played by academia, just kind of being that annoying burr in the saddle and saying, well, wait a second, I got a question here. That's kind of, that's what we get paid the big bucks to do.
Well, so I like that. Can I build on that just a little bit too? Because there's an important aspect that you hit on, and we've kind of alluded to a little bit, and that is what is the workforce that that the country needs to tackle these things? What does it really look like? And you're going to have again, it's going to be a spectrum, but you have foreign policy specialists, right? You have again, professional military officers, you have diplomats, you have financiers, you have people that work on Wall Street in a variety of ways. You have policymakers, right, that are interested in this. But what does your specialist look like for economic statecraft, and what's the vehicle? What are the vehicles? What is the path for them to mature and to grow in this area, so that we do have a good workforce that can think about the things that you're talking about, and they're practitioners too, right? They understand the dynamics of the economy. They understand geopolitics and how geoeconomics and geopolitics collide, right? And that goes to again to more so your world, Will, and that economic statecraft doesn't really have a home right now in academia. There's a lot of places where it's addressed tangentially or even rejected, frankly. Is it political science? Is it foreign policy? Is it strategic studies? Is it economics? Is it in the business school? These are all I have talked to, and I know, Will, you've probably you're living it, right, on a daily basis. Everyone's, to your point earlier, everyone's taking a different approach to it based on where they sit. So we don't have an established discipline on this, but you're seeing one emerge. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, Will, since you're living this on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I did not pay Tim to say any of that. But you're exactly right. I think that we're still just early on in the maturation of the topic of the field. Again, I think we'll get it figured out over time, but there's ways that we could accelerate that learning curve. And I think the way I think about this is like actively catalyzing these conversations and actively engaging these kinds of questions, I think helps get us up that learning curve faster than it might happen naturally or organically. To answer your question about the workforce piece, you do need a range of skills to be effective in this space, because you have to understand the economic dynamics. And those are both microeconomic dynamics at the firm level in particular industries and sectors, also the flow of capital and finance, but there's also macroeconomic dynamics about what does innovation look like and how is productivity gains going to resonate across the economy over time. How do you manage labor issues and workforce flows? So you need kind of that economic background. You need the analytical capabilities to understand the data that you're seeing. So when you get data back from the system, you have to be able to interpret that and understand what you're looking at and what do these jobs numbers mean and what does this mean and what does this growth in this sector indicate from a national security perspective. But then that skill set also has to be sitting alongside an understanding of the geopolitical or geoeconomic or geostrategic or strategic or economic statecraft grand strategy paradigms where you think in terms of long-run competitive dynamics, foreign policy dynamics, national security, and understanding of national security priorities. And right now, these worlds have historically been siloed. So if you grow up in the econ world, you generally don't ask these questions that are related to national security. If you're in the security studies world, you don't have the skill set to kind of go deep on the economic side. And I would add a third piece, which is kind of the international familiarity of the dynamics of the region, of partners and allies, and potential adversary dynamics. I think having all three of those knowledge bases would be the ideal sort of uh, starting ingredients for a workforce that would be capable of moving seamlessly between the private sector and government service. Because the reality, particularly in some of these emerging technologies, these cutting edges, the most dynamic parts of our economic system, they tend to move really fast. And it's not long before government is behind and out of step and playing catch up ball with the state of the art in a number of these areas. And so I think we're going to need, for the time being, we're going to need the ability to have cross-fertilization on the part of individuals or human capital coming out of these areas into government for a time, going from government back into these areas, because that's how you'll bring over a true understanding of the realities on the ground of what's happening in these different areas and these different fields. So in the long run, I think it takes a while to kind of build up the pipeline of human capital workforce training to be able to get the right skills into the labor force to be effective in this domain. We're working on that at the Bush School and in other places. But that'll take a little while. In the meantime, I think the best way to kind of make up for this, and I've grown increasingly convinced of the value of teams as I've gotten older and wiser. No one single person is going to be able to be an expert across all of these areas and all of these fields, but you can compensate for that by having the team that has those various strengths as part of the components of the team. So you could cross-pollinate and cross-fertilize with different people that are bringing different perspectives and different expertise to the table, and then be able to compensate in the short run that way.
Yeah, part of that community is real quick to wrap that up, because I think those are all great points, Will. What we've experienced, if I could speak for both of us, I think you have there's this community of reservists, like military reservists, that have one foot in the financial, economic world, business world, right, and the other foot in national security. And then there's also a retired military community too, right? I think we've worked with business executives, national security closely, Ben's. And a lot of those are reservists or retired, or they have some associated. Some of them are not completely at all, but that's again a natural place too, where we could look to with people and with a foot in both worlds, right? That we can springboard from.
So we've gone over what an economic statecraft discipline would look like, what a workforce would look like, but what would intelligence look like? How could we ramp up business intelligence capabilities that would be native to the U.S. government? Just what would that look like tactically?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I know Will and I have talked about this quite a bit because it's necessary. It goes to what data is collected, where is it coming from? We as a society, obviously, there's laws against the government collecting intelligence on our citizens and our businesses and all that kind of stuff. So how do we get to a place, right, where we can take business intelligence, which is open source, it's out there, businesses are doing it on a daily basis, it's investing a lot of money in it so that they can understand, again, those risk factors, the dynamics of the economy that they're in, make good decisions moving forward. How do you fuse that with what traditionally the government has focused on from an intelligence standpoint? How do you do that within the law? Do we need to change laws? But fusing that picture together so we have a good understanding of whatever economic statecraft objectives policymakers want to pursue, that they have a good understanding for the threat picture, right, for the intelligence picture domestically and abroad, to make good decisions. So right now, again, those activities occur, right, but they're disparate. They're not There's not an inherently obvious place where that fusion takes place. There are partnerships that happen on a daily basis in that regard. And then again, one of the reasons why we have this summit is because you get these communities together that might not necessarily be talking or collaborating, and we're able to bring them together as a nonpartisan think tank, right? As an academic community, and bring the actors together so they can work together. But right now, but it's something we need to do, right? So we can make thoughtful decisions moving forward. We need to figure out the policy. We need to figure out the law to make sure we're good to go. What did I miss, Will?
Well, I was just going to highlight something that you had mentioned, Tim, but because we don't necessarily have, earlier, Maddie, you had alluded, we might not have the optimal organizational design or institutional apparatus in place. So the way that we have traditionally compensated for those kinds of shortfalls is we'll fall back on social capital. So we'll use personal networks, like, oh, I have a buddy over there, let me give that person a call and ask her what's going on with them. And so that personal sort of social capital has been something that we've been able to identify very early on as being an important facilitator and a way to kind of have the system operate in spite of itself in some ways, despite these challenges, despite these silos, despite these barriers that may exist organizationally, and often not even intentionally. Often they're unintentional, but to actually work around it and to get stuff done, people will frequently fall back on relying on that social capital. And that's been something that, as Tim had alluded, this is our fifth of these symposia that we've gathered. And one of the important things that we recognized very early on was to explicitly try to build that social capital, to be able to have people talk to other people outside of their silos, outside of their lane, and begin to get to know and see the problem set from how they see it. Again, I don't want to get into any specifics on this, because one of the other things that's really important to us is that we conduct all these activities under what I call Vegas rules. So what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But you can at least tell stories about, like, oh, that wild trip to Vegas, or that time that I was in Vegas. And so that's kind of where the report comes out. This is without attribution, without naming names or anything. We just wanted to be able to share out some of the important and interesting insights that came out as a result of these conversations. But that social capital, Tim, I think was kind of the point I wanted to put on what you were talking about, and being able to develop a network, a cadre of professionals in this space, almost as a stopgap measure until we could really have a professional pipeline of human capital to fill the needs of the country and the private sector. We're sort of putting more duct tape on it and keeping the machine up in the air in the interim by building these networks and being able to have that more informal connective tissue across the silos.
So one more thing to add, Will, all great points there. And I know we've talked about this too. As an example to look to over time in recent years, the cyber warfare kind of world, which transcends, right? I mean, it touches pretty much everything. The partnership or lack thereof, or the maturity and the evolution of partnerships between the private sector and government, and how to effectively secure and at the same time allow for pursuits toward prosperity, economic, commerce and all that kind of stuff to flow. We had to figure that out, and I think we're definitely a much better place than we were 10, 15 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. Authorities were figured out, right? Silos were figured out. It's not perfect, but oh my goodness, it's in a much better place now. There's much more seamlessness between the private sector and the government than there was historically. So what do we have to learn from that front? Because again, economics transcends all aspects of society. So what do we have to learn from there? From not just, back to your question, not from just fusing intelligence, but across the board there.
So we're almost done, but I wanted to go over these excellent policy recommendations that you two have put together for the executive branch, legislative branch, industry, and then academics. So, Will, first, what was your favorite recommendation that you guys put together, and what's something that is really difficult or is very low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, well, like I said before, Maddie, this is uncharted territory for us as a country, as a system, as a federal government, as a national economy, even as a regional economy. So the reality is, we're going to mess this up. We're going to screw stuff up. We're going to try a lot of different things, and a lot of these things are not going to work. But some of it's going to work, and some of it is going to succeed, and some of it's going to be the right path forward. And I'm confident over time that we have this remarkable ability to self-correct and to identify these kinds of changes, these kinds of shortcomings, and be able to kind of move forward in the areas where we should as a country. That's been our historic performance, and I have no doubt that we're going to be able to rise to the occasion again in this domain. Um, but that said, I think that there's ways that we could be a little more deliberate and efficient at that process of discovery and evaluation about a lot of these different innovations. Because we have tried in the last 12 months, we have tried a lot of new things. There's been a lot of movement, a lot of changes in our posture in the domain of economic statecraft. This has been probably the biggest theme that we had in this year's symposium, was just how much had shifted since we last got together and since we last met. And I think that that area is going to be a continuing area of innovation and trying of new things, and the willingness to really innovate in this space, in this domain of economic statecraft. And so I think my favorite recommendation is really calling attention to, on the intelligence side, the necessity to be able to get, as Tim was talking about earlier, the information to support this kind of decision making, and to make sure that we're leveraging the knowledge that's existent in the private sector, finding ways to ingest that into the USG, and being able to connect that in and diffuse that together in a way that's going to be impactful and meaningful to help inform the decision making that we're looking to do in this space. I also think so. That's kind of my favorite one. I think is on the intelligence side, because I think it's one that's able to be done. I think it's an area that we should be able to do. It's a space that we would benefit remarkably from doing. And I think it's an area that there's reason to be really optimistic that we'll be able to make real progress there. So that'd be probably that's what I'd highlight. Although I would encourage folks we made it very easy to read. So we call out, like, these are recommendations for the legislative branch. These are recommendations for the executive branch. These are recommendations to academia. Frankly, I think one of the areas that academia needs to work on is to really think about, how do we organize ourselves and how do we organize the research agenda around these really important questions that our country needs answered? And how do we allocate those questions and marry that up with the supply side, if you will, of talent that's resident in the academy? And how do we orchestrate that aligning of demand and supply from an intellectual perspective? That's another area that I think is worth checking out.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Tim, what's your favorite?
So I'm going to build on something Will said, because it's actually part of another one of our recommendations first, but then I'll tell you what my favorite one is. So, Will, I think you're just on the mark, and I know we've talked about this, but there's all these policies that have been put into play. We've put several new laws and provisions of laws set into play with regard to practicing economic statecraft on a contemporary front. To that end, from a congressional standpoint, right, one of the fundamental reasons the Congress exists, right, is for oversight. So how do we know we're doing the right thing? How do we know if the laws that we put into place are effective? What can we learn from what we've put into place in the executive and from a congressional standpoint? So what does that path look like moving forward? Congress has done that again in certain aspects, but how do you codify it a little more into the institution, right, as something that's consistently paid attention to? And then this leads into what I, as a I know Congress isn't very popular, but as an institution, I'm intrigued by it, and I think it's really one of the most important entities that we have in this country, because it represents who we are as a people. If you look across the board, so the third recommendation for the legislative branch really is to make sure that we have an institutional path for legislation that's related to economic statecraft, carved out. So right now, and this is kind of like academia, right? You have silos, so you have the Foreign Affairs Committee is responsible for certain things. You have Energy and Commerce, responsible for other things. You have, of course, the Armed Services Committee is responsible for other things. So you have all this shared jurisdiction, and the death knell historically for legislation. If it gets referred to multiple committees, right? It may as well just kill it right there, because it's just not going to make it through. So what is, from an institutional standpoint, that path? I'll tell you, this House Select Committee on the competition with China has done a great job in highlighting some really important issues on the economic statecraft front. However, it doesn't have jurisdiction really. Its whole purpose is to elevate these things so the committees of jurisdiction can deal with them, but they have to go work with the other committees, say, hey, this is really scary and bad, or this is something really important that we need to pursue. Can you help me get it across the board from where you're sitting from a jurisdictional standpoint? So building that path, and maybe it's the chairman from several committees of oversight getting together on a routine basis and saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. How do we work this out? I don't know, but again, this is us trying to figure out as a country the path forward, and our institutions the path forward to making sure that these issues are addressed substantively from an enduring standpoint. So that's my favorite. I think it's really important, and it's going to touch, hopefully, all the things that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. And so our audience, sure you're all from business, government, academia, what have you, but what's one thing quick, Will and Tim, that you ask of our audience as the discipline changes and develops?
Yeah, I would just say to stay engaged. I think this is an important topic. I think there's unprecedented challenges that our country faces. There's no monopoly on the right answers. I think this is one of those areas where the more voices that come in, the better. This is it's a moment, I think, in our nation's history when we're facing these kinds of challenges in a way that's relatively unprecedented. And we would benefit from having a very robust and transparent conversation about what right ought to look like. A lot of these decisions are inherently political because the way I think about economic statecraft, you are necessarily distorting markets, or you're responding to other people's distortion of markets. It's by definition an interference kind of role for government that government's playing in the economic space, in the economic sphere. And so I think that as a sort of first principle ought to guide the conversation. Let's recognize that first, do no harm. We've got an amazing country that has an incredible economic success story behind it. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we don't screw that up. And then once we can sort of make sure that that's safe and sound, and that means protecting it, if other people are deliberately trying to do things that undermine that and are deliberately targeting vulnerabilities in that system, we need to respond to that. But I think starting with some of those basic common grounds is an important next step, is to sort of get everybody on the same sheet of music. We're going to at least sort of identify the fundamental foundations, these core assumptions that maybe we could share in common about the path forward, or who we are as a country, or what works, what doesn't work. And then go out and get the data and test it and figure out what's working, what's not working, and where we want to go. And then ultimately, as I started saying, this is a political decision. So we have a political system. We have elections. Elections will have consequences. Those are important. Those are who we are. That is the way that our system works and functions. It is not a bad thing. It is a good thing. So I think we want to design an economic strategy, an economic statecraft strategy that's going to be robust and is going to be sustainable in the sense that it can endure sort of micro vacillations and ups and downs in the political cycle and political fortunes in a way that can sustain American greatness for decades to come. Because I think that's ultimately where there is common ground. We Everybody that I've had the privilege of interacting with in this domain loves the United States. We love our country. We all want to make sure that it's successful and is able to move forward. And I think that's the common ground. We just got to figure out what's the best way to do that. And there we can try a lot of different things because we're in very uncharted territory. We're in unknown waters. So let's try things out and then figure out what's working, what's not working, and then figure out where we want to proceed and where we want to cut back and where we want to double down and that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't think I could sum it any better than you just did, so you must have been thinking about this for a while. There's a couple things, just really quick to top things off. Allies and partners, right? Really thinking about how, as we navigate and move forward, how we're bringing them along and how we're interacting with them. That's hugely important. We as we try out new things, as Will was talking about. What does that look like? We do talk about in the report, the response that our allies and partners and have taken, and what that looks like. So just thinking about that. But the other thing, which is something that we've tried to think about and work through and understand, especially in the context of the conversation we've had today, is what are those incentives for the private sector to work with government, to work with policymakers, to get to a thoughtful path forward that's mutually beneficial, right? And again, is reflective of our values as a society and the way we've worked traditionally and the rule of law and such. So communicating those, as Will was saying, is paramount, and then engaging in that dialogue so we can get to a better place.
I think that's a great place to lead off. Any closing thoughts, Tim?
So the last thing that I'll have to say is the work that Will and I and others have done, and the folks that we've brought together, I think is really valuable to this growing, emerging, evolving area. But it doesn't come for free. So if you like the work that you've seen, I think there's going to be a link in the chat. You can donate to the cause, so we can keep doing this work moving forward. But thank you very much.
Yeah, could not agree more. Tim, Will, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to the Potomac Institute for having me. We could not get to everything. We chatted about a lot, but not everything. So please make sure to read that excellent report. We've just added the link in the chat again, and then it's also on the Potomac Institute's website. So do make sure to check it out. There are, I think, 11 policy recommendations that are really good that you all should read. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to the audience for participating, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you all.